The opposition continued to hammer away at the government over the We Charity controversy. You'll remember the Liberals chose that charity to run a multi-million-dollar grant program for student volunteers. We has pulled out of running that program, and we've since learned that the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister's families have financial ties to the organization. The Ethics Commissioner is investigating both Justin Trudeau and Bill Morneau over possible conflicts of interest, but MPs are also looking into the situation. The CBC's Evan Dyer joins us with the latest on that. Hey, Evan, the clerk of the Privy Council, the country's top bureaucrat, was in front of the Finance Committee today as that committee investigates or probes this controversy. What were the highlights? What did you learn from that testimony from Mr. Shugart?
Well, in some ways, he gave support, Vashi, to the government's claims that it was the public servants and bureaucrats rather than politicians who pushed We as a candidate to administer this student grant program, the student summer grant program. He talked also about his own involvement, making it clear that he'd had very little personal involvement in this file, at least in the early days. He said he'd never discussed it in person himself with the Prime Minister. In a way, this was sort of reminiscent of Michael Wernick's appearance when he was Canada's top public servant in the SNC-Lavalin hearings last year. We may recall, of course, that Michael Wernick also appeared to support some of the government's contentions during that affair. This was perhaps a less forceful defense of the government, more nuanced. He talked about ESDC's role in all of this, and Rachel Wernick, of course, who is from ESDC, has already been identified as one public servant who was very much behind the selection of the We charity. We saw Ian Shugart today say that the Privy Council office did have questions about why We was being recommended for this contribution agreement without any competition. He says that they did get answers. They got an explanation, he said, with answers. We didn't get very many details on what the reasons were that he says were cited for going that way with that single source approach, but he said that they did satisfy him. And he also talked about the Prime Minister's role and the Finance Minister's role, making the point that this program was going to administer almost $1 billion of taxpayers' money. And he said that any program of that scale, you would expect to see those two at the very least aware and involved. Let's watch some of what he had to say.
Given the importance of the issue to the government's overall efforts to deal with the impacts of the pandemic, and given the scale of the contribution up to $900 million, I would emphasize for the committee, up to, I do not see a way that the Prime Minister or the Finance Minister responsible for public funds could not have had involvement in the policy development and in the approval of finances on this scale.
So he talks there about them being involved in the approval, which seems to be suggesting that given the scale of this program that they had to be involved. But at other points he said that he was making no comment on the issue of recusal. A couple of times he said that he was making no comment on the issue of recusal in Cabinet. So it was left somewhat unclear. He seemed to be saying that it wouldn't be natural for them not to be involved, but at the same time he didn't want to take that final step and say the program was so big that the Prime Minister and Finance Minister needed to be involved in the decision.
Just quickly, Evan, because the President is just stepping up to the microphone, I did want to ask you about one other thing that jumped out at me in the testimony, and that was around what they describe as due diligence. So what Cabinet or what the Public Service reviewed in order to award this agreement, it sounds like it didn't really include much about the charity itself other than its ability to deliver the program.
No, they were pressed by Conservative Pierre Poilievre about the due diligence they've done into We Charity's finances. This is not simply the finances of that program or what we would bring to that program, but the background to the charity. And of course, we've seen a lot of investigations of We's financial structure, real estate holdings, and so on that have shown that it's at least somewhat unusual for a charity. It has done some things that are not necessarily normal in the charitable field. But when Ian Shugart was asked about that, he said that no public servant had looked into that to his knowledge. He said that they limited their investigation, if you like, or their diligence simply to the ability to administer the program itself. And of course, also today we saw a union leader, Chris Aylward, the head of the Public Service Alliance of Canada, come on and question the notion that We was indeed uniquely well suited to administer this program. And he said that in fact it's because of the $43 million, up to $43 million that the federal government was willing to give We, that We was able to do this in the first place. It's not that We came along showed up, if you like, uniquely able to administer this program without any help from the government. We also saw some evidence, in fact, from a labor lawyer who suggested that the structure of this whole student grant program, summer jobs program, was flawed, and that it was set up in a way that it intended to pay people less than minimum wage and might not have even been in compliance with some labor laws. So there was quite a bit of criticism today also at the committee for the way this program was set up and was intended to run. And we may see more, because tomorrow Bill Morneau himself, the finance minister, tomorrow afternoon will be appearing at the committee. And of course, next week, next Tuesday, we're due to hear from the Kielburger brothers, who run the We Charity.
Lots more to come. Thanks for the update, Evan. The CBC's Evan Dyer.
So gross and disgusting that this Prime Minister keeps using the pandemic as an excuse for his corruption. The very first act that this Prime Minister did when the pandemic hit was try to give himself unprecedented power and eliminate the role of the opposition in Parliament. And now we know why, Mr. Speaker, because when they're pushing $300 billion worth of deficit out the door, they will stop and take the time to reward their friends. That is the essence of this Liberal Party under this Liberal Prime Minister. I don't even have a question, Mr. Speaker. It's just disgusting.
One would think that when a House of Commons is about to pass legislation worth over $50 billion to help businesses with an extension of the wage subsidy, that there might be a question from the opposition on that, or on anything they want to bring forward. The fact of the matter is we remain focused on giving Canadians the support they need to get through this challenging pandemic.
The Prime Minister, as you heard there, and various ministers faced another barrage of questions today about the We controversy, and the Clerk of the Privy Council, Ian Shugart. He's kind of the top bureaucrat in the country, the liaison between the Prime Minister and the bureaucracy. He was grilled on the issue before the Finance Committee this morning. Mr. Shugart said that he was not personally aware of the financial ties between the We Charity and the Prime Minister's family, but he did state the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister couldn't recuse themselves, or he wouldn't imagine that they would, from discussions about the $900 million program. Let's bring in the Power Panel to discuss these developments. In Toronto, Supriya Dwivedi, host of The Morning Show, Global News Radio 640. Shakir Chambers is a senior consultant with Navigator. He's in Canmore, Alberta this evening, and political commentator and former NDP MP Françoise Boivin joins us from across the river in Gatineau. Hello, all three of you. Great to see you.
Hello.
Hi. So I'll start off with the House of Commons, and then I'll also ask you, I want to get into what we heard from Mr. Shugart. But on the politics, the strategy being employed, Shakir, it was quite a sort of, I guess, definitive statement today from Mr. Scheer. They're certainly ramping up their attacks, their criticism of the government on this. What do you think the strategy behind that is? How do you think the Prime Minister handled it?
Well, I mean, the Prime Minister didn't really address Mr. Scheer's core concern. It didn't seem like he wanted to talk about the We Charity. But if you're the Conservatives, I mean, the clear indications here is that there are personal connections between Trudeau and his family and what was going on as far as them being involved with We, making comments and statements with We, and the money being donated to them or paid to them for their appearances. So I think if you're the Conservatives, you keep hammering this. You want the Prime Minister to actually address this in some way, be in the Finance Committee in some way, and then ultimately point to his poor judgment, right? When you have a government who's close to $1 billion contract going to an organization that was paying his family to participate in certain events, that becomes a question of judgment. Is this the right person to handle the pandemic? Is this the right person to be in charge of a historic debt and deficit that we face? And I mean, ultimately, it doesn't look like that's the case if the Prime Minister is not willing to address some of the key questions surrounding the We Charity controversy.
Do you think the opposition's attacks, Supriya, what is your instinct about whether or not they're working? And I'll just quickly point out, we've seen 3 polls now. 2 of them from Abacus and from Angus Reid do show that since the end of June, since this all started percolating, the Prime Minister's approval ratings have taken, or approval numbers have taken a hit, while Leger out today showed that the opposite, that in fact that the Prime Minister's approvals haven't. What do you think from a sort of political, strategic viewpoint? Do you think these attacks are working?
Quite honestly, no. And I think for a couple of reasons. I mean, number one, we're in a pandemic, right? So I don't know if people are necessarily super plugged into what would be basically a journalist insider kind of story for the time being until we get to know a little bit more about the organization itself or more details come out. I mean, there's now new details about their We's real estate holdings that I think are quite troubling from the organization's perspective, but that's not really on the Prime Minister himself. I think in terms of, you know, the clip we just heard with Mr. Scheer minister kind of going at it with the prime minister, it makes for good theater. But in terms of like substantive criticism, I think we have to also remember that for most people, they probably don't necessarily have a negative impression of we. This isn't some, evil giant corporation that's been found of like killing some obscure cute animal species in the middle of a rainforest, right? Like they were there to administer what is ultimately a good program. And I think on the face of it, if you are, especially if you're a parent of like a middle school or high school aged child, you probably have an overall positive impression of we. So I think we're going to have to learn a lot more, and more details are going to need to come out in order for some of these, attacks from the opposition to actually really have any sort of, substantive effect. And I'm not negating the Abacus poll and the Angus Reid poll that did show the Trudeau Liberals dropping.
Yeah, there's two things that jumped out at me there. First of all, just the idea that ultimately it's a good program. I think there are some genuine questions being raised about that, even from Liberals themselves. We had Nathaniel Erskine-Smith on the show last week, who was, and volunteer organizations and various other charities who are saying, why was it set up this way? Could it have been done through the public service? Like, that is almost a separate conversation. But I think those questions, I understand why they're being asked. Françoise, on the point about whether or not it's resonating. Various schools of thought on that as well. I was surprised yesterday when David Coletto with Abacus said there's a high level of, more people are tuned in, or as many as were in SNC are tuned in now. Obviously that changed over the course of that controversy, and it might here as well. What's your impression of that and your perspective on how the opposition is handling it and how the government is?
It's like a symphony. It starts sometimes very quiet, then it augments its tempo, and then a big crescendo. And that is a bit what is happening with we. I've talked to numerous people with my mask, but anyway, during the weekend at campground and elsewhere, and everybody was telling me that they are following that story, because I was just wondering if it was actually scoring any points for the opposition and also for the government, just to know what to do better with our hard-earned tax money that we send in big amount to their place. And people were aware. What really hit me, though, was the fact that it is starting to give charity or charitable organization a bad name, and sitting on numerous organizations that depends mostly on big fundraisers and things like that. And I'm not talking political. I'm talking palliative care house and things like that. And we know how hard it is to go and try to raise some donations. And the first thing people always say to us is, "Oh, how do you manage the thing?" Which is fair questions. And the more it's going to start being on those topics, the more it hurt their own charity, the We Charity movement. So it might be all for good things, but at the same time, it has so many opportunities with details. We're talking millions in real estate. It has the making much more than SNC Lavalin to hit the imagination of the public. But I was not impressed by the conservative in the House today. Sure, those were harsh words by Andrew Scheer, talking corruption. It was back to the future. I kept hearing sponsorship words that we heard all the time during the Martin government after he set up the Montgomery Commission. So listening to all this and then having a bunch of conservatives get up and say, are you on this side, the side of the deputy prime minister, or are you on the side of the minister of foreign affairs, to try to divide the own bench of the Liberals? That for me was a bit childish. I see the point. But that's not the point. The point is in the details and to do better and show that you would do better.
I wonder, Shakir, what you think the key is to whether or not this lasts, how long, how much oxygen it gets. Both Supriya and Françoise talked about the We Charity itself. We're anticipating next week the brothers, Mark and Craig Kielburger behind it, are going to be testifying before the Finance Committee. I think it is on July 28th. I'd note also, I think it was almost a week ago on the same night, we got a release right during the show from the charity. They're reviewing all their governance structures. So there was an admission there that as journalists dig into the practices of the charity, there is some cause for concern. I wonder if the oxygen given to this story depends on what comes out of or whether or not it could be limited as well.
Yeah, I would just say, I'm not so sure the Conservatives are actually focused on and what's happening with I think they're trying to show the connection between the Prime Minister's bad judgment and what's happened with this program. They're trying to focus more on, for example, the clerk testified today that they didn't focus on the organization's finances, for example. They just focused on can they deliver the program. That's fine, but how can you be in a situation where the public service doesn't ask that question, political staff doesn't ask that question, cabinet doesn't ask that question? Like, it's just showing a lack of transparency, accountability, and just poor judgment by those in the Liberal government to do the proper vetting before rolling out this program. So I think to what Supriya said earlier, while there's some notion that they're going to be talking about obviously they're involved in this situation, I don't think the Conservatives are going to drill home the point that is not the right organization or is doing something corrupt. It's more so Justin Trudeau and the Liberal government have made poor choices. This is clearly a trend from the first ethics to the second ethics to the third ethics potentially violation that's going to happen with the Prime Minister. And I think that's the core narrative they want to ride out. As long as the Liberal government continues to just trickle out information or media and journalists continue to investigate and get new pieces every single day, this will continue to be a story for weeks and weeks and weeks until we kind of get to the end of what is actually going on here. The Prime Minister might do himself a favor by actually just be forthcoming, put everything out there, try to kill this story as fast as possible. But as long as we continue to drag this out for days and weeks, it's continued to be a story. And I'm pretty sure the Conservatives will continue to hammer the point that lack of judgment, lack of transparency and lack of accountability from the Liberal government.
To that point, Supriya, two interesting things came, I thought, from Mr. Shugart's testimony. The first being that he felt like it would have been, I'm paraphrasing here, but he didn't think it would be appropriate for Bill Morneau and Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister, not to be involved in the decision-making given the scope of the project and the amount of money. But secondly, that Cabinet met twice to discuss and then ratify the agreement. And at no time did Bill Morneau say, hey, my daughter works there? Or Justin Trudeau says, the Prime Minister says he didn't know about the money that his mom and his brother got. But especially the Finance Minister, nobody said, hey, there might be this ethical concern at either of those meetings.
Yeah, and I think to Shakir's point of trying to really hammer, the issue with this Liberal government, I think they may have an easier job doing that with respect to the Finance Minister than the Prime Minister himself, just because to Mr. Shugart's own testimony, he had mentioned that a lot of the Prime Minister's involvement with the organization was already a matter of it being in the public domain. But certainly, the minister's daughter having worked for the charity is not really something that would be subject to, an easy Googleable search or anything like that. So if they were really going to try and get this to stick to the government, it may be easier to, shift their focus a little bit away from the Prime Minister onto the Finance Minister. Not that I'm doling out tips here, but it just strikes me as somewhat odd that they would continue to hammer this point, especially after, at least from my vantage point, a lot of what Mr. Shugart had to say kind of took the air out of the opposition's tires.
All right. Well, I got to take a quick commercial break. We'll see how Françoise wants to jump in. Françoise, we'll get you right after.
Just to say,
yeah, go ahead.
For me, what Mr. Shugart was saying today is absolutely rewriting the whole code of ethics. So basically what he's saying, the clerk of the Privy Council is saying, we knew that he had a conflict, so that's all right. The amount of the contract, which is huge, so basically saying what the opposition party is saying, that it was a lot of money, $900 million affected to that thing. We needed the Finance Minister and the Prime Minister of Canada. I don't know any exception in the law that states that, if the importance of the contract, you might have a conflict of interest, but you can still decide on it. I thought it was absolutely appalling to hear the clerk say something like that today.
Tell me what you really
shock,
think.
Honestly.
Tell me what you really think, Françoise.
But I don't think it's a legal matter. It's a conventional matter.
What do you mean by that? In layman's terms,
just in terms of it being responsible government, right? So ultimately, the Prime Minister would be responsible, even if he were to recuse himself. The buck sort of stops with him.
I think I get that.
But he has to recuse himself anyway.
I sort of get the argument
I don't disagree, Françoise, for what it's worth, but yeah.
I sort of understand the idea that Mr. Shugart put forth was, hey, this is a massive decision. Of course, the Prime Minister, with a lot of money involved, of course the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister have to be involved. Hey, we did know about, because it's in the public domain, Justin Trudeau has ties to the organization, but the opposition was quick to question, well, so at what amount is it not okay for that to happen? Like, where's the line there? And beyond all of that, beyond all of that, I mean, there's optics around everything that I think factor into our discussion as well. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.